Hey, it's Mr. Morrow here. I'm going to go through your World War II and Great Depression study guide questions as quick as I can to prepare you for your test, which is Wednesday. So I'm just going to rattle through the questions and basically give you, the Cliff Notes version of each of the answers. So definitely check out the online review sheet. It has information on the front and back about the Great Depression and World War II, so it should be good, but this should be helpful as well. So question number one, what were the Roaring Twenties? The Roaring Twenties were a period of time from 1920 to 1929, really like October of 1929, where the United States was in great shape. People were having a great time. It was really like a party. The economy was booming. Everybody was making money. It was great because women had opportunities. They could go work in cities. They started to date more. It was really where the idea of like the new woman started to develop. So you had this really like great kind of period. There was a Harlem Renaissance going on. There was lots of culture that was developing. Jazz was becoming popular. So basically think of The Great Gatsby. That's sort of like the 1920s in a nutshell. Question number two, what was the Dust Bowl? The Dust Bowl was a period of time in like the early 1930s, late 1920s in the Midwest, where farmers were unable to grow crops because the topsoil that they were using lacked the nutrients to grow crops, and once it became sort of this weak, light dirt, it resulted in these huge dust storms. So the dirt would fly into the air. It would make it very difficult for people to breathe, and it would basically ruin your chance at having a farm out in the Midwest on the Great Plains. So a lot of farmers had to either move west or abandon their farms. It was a really rough time. Question number three, what was the Great Migration? The Great Migration was a period of time from 1915 to 1930 where about 1 million African Americans moved from the south to the north. So you saw places like Chicago and New York suddenly get a huge influx of African Americans in their communities. In some places this caused, racial tension, and so there were, race riots like that of Chicago. But for the most part, it was great for African Americans. They were able to escape Jim Crow laws that were, sort of making life difficult in the South, and they were given more opportunities up north. Question number four, what was the Harlem Renaissance? The Harlem Renaissance was basically what we just talked about. It was African Americans developing their own specific culture. So, you could say people like, Langston Hughes, for example, African American authors, writers, painters, musicians, like Duke Ellington, they got their start during this Harlem Renaissance. Question number five, what was the Bonus Army and what did they want? The Bonus Army was a group of veterans in Washington, D.C. that marched against Congress. Basically, they were trying to get a pension, which they were promised in 1945. And so they were lobbying the government to give them that pension early because during the Great Depression, people really needed money. They were poor, they were starving to death. They had to wait in soup lines in order to feed themselves. It was tough. Eventually, it was broken up by the U.S. Army. They went in there and burned their sort of like shanty town where they were camping out outside of Washington, D.C., and they got all the veterans out of there. A couple people died during that struggle. Question number six, what was the event that started the Great Depression? It was the stock market crash in October of 1929. So people had basically bought stocks on credit, and then that whole system started to collapse very, very quickly. People started to sell very quick, and so the value of stocks and thus the value of companies sort of vanished overnight. So it was a period of a couple days. It started on like October 24th and went to October 29th, 1929. And so during those couple days, that's when the stock market dropped severely in value. Question number seven, when did the Great Depression start? You could say October 1929, that's a good answer. Question number eight, the Great Depression impacted the economies where? That's what it should be, it's a typo. It impacted economies all over the world. So you can talk about how in the United States, it obviously had the impact with the New York Stock Exchange crashing. But in Germany, for instance, they had, super high unemployment and high on inflation, and that gave, the perfect opportunity to Adolf Hitler to rise to power. It was in Europe, it was in Asia, it was in the United States. So the economy was sort of like the global economy at this point, and it affected everybody. Question number 9. What were the names of the 10 cities during the Great Depression that started popping up all over the U.S.? They were called Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover. So, question 10 is Herbert Hoover, who was the president. Question 11, who replaced that president, is FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the governor from New York. He had polio, so he had to wear like these knee braces, and sometimes would have people escort him places. He was also our first president to be sort of handicapped. He would occasionally be photographed in a wheelchair. Question number 12, what was the plan initiated in 1933 to save the economy? It was called the New Deal. So when FDR became president, in his first 100 days, he had something called the New Deal. He didn't know there would be 2 New Deals. So inside that, he had a couple different programs, which are questions 13 through 16. So like the WPA. The WPA was created in 1935. It's the Works Progress Administration. Basically, they built roads, they built public buildings. They employed artists, they employed musicians, they employed people that typically wouldn't have jobs during this time period. So if you look at government buildings, a lot of the beautiful work that was done in them was done during the 1930s thanks to the WPA. Question 14, what was the CCC? It's the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was a group of young men who were basically paid to go kind of like dig ditches, improve national parks, build roads through forests, that kind of thing. It really was designed to have young men out there doing something rather than, being at home begging for food, trying to get a job. So what they would do is they would take most of the young men's salary and send it back home to their family and give a small portion to the men that were working there so that they could survive on that. So it was sort of a way of supporting American families indirectly. What was the TVA? That was the Tennessee Valley Authority. Basically, it's a program that took place in Tennessee, and it was designed to provide cheap hydroelectric power to lots of Americans in the Southeast. I believe it provided power for 9 different states. So it brought cheap electricity to a lot of rural parts of the South that prior to that did not have access. What was the AAA? It was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The idea behind that was they were going to pay farmers money to not grow as many crops, to not breed their animals, to not have as many pigs or chickens grown. They were paying them to reduce the supply in order to meet the demand, so that way the price would go up. And it actually resulted in about a 50% boost in income for farmers. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but growing less allowed them to sell it at a higher price because the product was more scarce or more rare. So it actually helped the economy in the long run. Question number 17, what were the 3 R's? It's relief, recovery, and reform. So with relief, what they wanted to do was they wanted to make sure that people weren't going to starve to death. Recovery, somehow have a plan to get people back in their homes, back in their jobs, and reform, change the laws so that this couldn't happen again. So, what kind of safety nets can we put into the government to guarantee that everything would be okay? Number 18, why were the fireside chats important? Basically, FDR every week would talk to America, and he started to get people to think that he was like their friend, essentially. He would say everything's going to be okay, and he would describe like the different policies that were going on, and highlight how America was recovering, and he was really selling hope to a lot of Americans. Question 19, what was the bank holiday? The bank holiday was the first 8 days of FDR's administration. He closed all the banks, and he promised not to reopen them until they were certified safe by the government. Number 20, what was the Social Security Act? The Social Security Act was the first safety net, basically, for the unemployed or the elderly who had retired. The idea was that these people who were sort of down on their luck or had very little or no income would be provided an income by the government. So all the taxpayers pay a little bit of their money into Social Security, and then it is distributed out to these people who are unemployed or old. What was the Wagner Act? The Wagner Act was a like national relations, labor kind of law, and what it did was it allowed for minimum wage, collective bargaining, basically gave workers rights. So in 1935, it sort of improved the situation for Americans that were working in factories and had jobs, but they were being underpaid. Question 22. So we're getting into World War II. Who was on the Axis and who was on the Allies during World War II? For the Axis, you had Japan, Germany, and Italy. For the Allies, you would eventually have the Soviet Union, the United States, France, Great Britain, and at the very end of the war, Italy. What country invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939 to start World War II? That is Nazi Germany. What was the Lend-Lease Act of 1941? The Lend-Lease Act was the United States saying to the Allies, so to France and England, we're going to give you as much money, we're going to give the Allies as much money as they need in order to fight this war. So eventually, during the course of the war, we would give out about $50 billion to the Allies so that they could fund their war machines. What was cash and carry? Cash and carry was a plan that FDR came up with saying we don't want to risk American lives, we don't want to risk American soldiers sending you weapons and sending you guns. So instead, you can come pick up these weapons, pick up these ships in the United States and take them back. So it was a way of avoiding, sort of the unrestricted submarine warfare that plagued the United States in World War I. What happened on December 7th, 1941? It was the attack at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese basically surprise attacked the United States. They were upset about an oil embargo that the United States had passed because Japan had been so aggressive in taking over other countries in Southeast Asia. Question 27, what was the invasion of Normandy, D-Day? That was when Allied forces, led by Eisenhower, would eventually attack 5 different beaches in Normandy, France, which is like a region of France sort of south of England. So they crossed the British Channel, or the English Channel, they cleared the mines, and they sent in their forces and stormed the beaches. Eventually, after about 15 hours, they overwhelmed the German forces and were able to create a foothold. And that allowed supplies and men to flow into Nazi-occupied France, which was now, liberated. Let's see. Question 28. What is island hopping? Island hopping is when American soldiers went from island to island throughout the Pacific, basically killing the Japanese, trying to take back each spot. The examples that people think of are like Midway. You could think of Okinawa, which was very, very difficult to take. They had, suicide bombers actually fighting against them. And then Iwo Jima, in which the Americans suffered greater losses than the Japanese while taking that island. So they've become famous for island hopping. Question 29, what 2 Japanese cities were hit by atomic bombs? That is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Question 30, what was the Yalta Conference? Basically, it was the big 3, so it was the US, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, and they got together to discuss what to do after the war. How are we going to rule? They decided eventually we're going to split between 4 powers, all of Europe. So England, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union will somehow have influence over all these areas to prevent a World War III. What was the Potsdam Conference? It was after the war. It was the same thing, essentially, but it was with Harry S. Truman because FDR had died, and they were trying to figure out exactly what the plan was going to be with Germany. Question 32, who were the leaders of Great Britain? That's Winston Churchill. The United States, FDR, and then Harry S. Truman. And the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. Who were the leaders of Japan? You had Emperor Hirohito. Germany, Adolf Hitler. And Italy, Benito Mussolini. Question 34, what were Japanese internment camps? They were camps in the United States where Japanese Americans, about 120,000 of them, were put into basically holding cells. They were like towns, essentially, where the Japanese were forced to live for a couple of years. The idea that, you know, having a large Japanese population on the West Coast might be dangerous if Japan tried to invade the United States, or, you know, they might have spies working for them. So the president ordered that all these Japanese Americans were going to be forced to live in here. And you have to understand that they're very different from concentration camps. There was no, you know, systematic killing of anybody. You know, they had, you know, city councils or town councils. They had education. They had church services. It wasn't great, but it wasn't the worst thing ever. You know, we weren't killing people like the Nazis were. And that brings me to my next question. Question 36, what were concentration camps? Concentration camps were work camps and extermination camps, basically death camps, throughout Nazi Germany's controlled territory. So, you know, into Poland and in Germany, they would take Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, anyone who Hitler deemed undesirable in his like future master race, and they would take them and put them in these camps, work them until they were, you know, starving to death or until they were too unhealthy to work, and then they would be, you know, either shot or put into gas chambers and then incinerated. Question 37, what was Rosie the Riveter? Rosie the Riveter was a bit of propaganda that was created by the United States to sort of show how women were helping in the work effort at home in the war effort. So you can see that like Rosie the Riveter, it was originally created by Norman Rockwell in 1943, but there are more modern sort of interpretations that make her look a little bit more feminine. And with that, it demonstrated how women were contributing to the war, even though they weren't, you know, out there killing Nazis or killing Japanese. Question 38, what was the Manhattan Project? It was a $2 billion project led by, you know, Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer, in which they developed uranium and plutonium-based atomic bombs, which would be dropped on Japan to end the war. Who was the president that decided to drop the bomb on Japan? It's Harry S. Truman. He did it on August 6th and August 9th, 1945. And finally, question 40, what was the GI Bill, or the Servicemen's Readjustment Act? The GI Bill was a way that the government was trying to help soldiers who were coming back sort of adjust to life. So they gave them opportunities to go to college, they could get vocational training in whatever field that they wanted. Basically, it was a program to make the transition for soldiers back to normal life easier. So they could get an education, or they could, you know, get training to help find a job. All right, guys, that's going to be it. Good luck on your test on Wednesday. If you have any questions, you can email me or contact me through the Remind app. All right, have a good one.